Welcome back from lunch. I hope everyone's had an enjoyable lunch and some interesting discussions. Got one or two announcements just before we get started with the afternoon agenda. Firstly, for the what was the 2 o'clock, we might be obviously running a little bit behind now, but the second panel discussion chaired by Andrea Petrozzi. Andrea would like, obviously we've heard quite a bit about different topics so far and relevant topics. This is the session on sort of classification and boosting. What Andrea would like was some questions potentially to ask to the panelists in that session. So you should be able to find some post-it notes on your tables, I believe. So if you've got any questions that you want to be asked, you can sort of hand those to someone from the UCAD team, or you can leave them in the middle of the table for them to be collected. And alongside that, I think there's an infographic as well. That's to help with sort of Tom Nightingale's contribution around boosting, but also that's I think that's behind a paywall normally, isn't it, Tom? So they're sort of hard copies of the infographic that they developed around boosting. So for those that have got an interest in that topic, then there's some copies of that infographic on your tables for you. And then the other thing was to just a mention for Ali's PhD in terms of he's doing some data collection. He's mentioned his PhD and the lack of data around prevalence. Following the forum, we're going to send out a link to you. If you could potentially help Ali with that in terms of disseminating that, then that would be really helpful. So they're the two announcements. So we'll move on now with the agenda for the afternoon. So we've got the second keynote now. So our second keynote speaker, Pippa Britton, unfortunately is unwell, but fortunately what we have managed to get is a recording of the presentation. So we're going to play that now. This is the presentation on, and this is a topic we've already discussed quite a bit already in terms of can classification learn from anti-doping. So this can be really interesting in terms of whether it resonates with some of the things that we've already heard around these discussions with the panels and people's views from the audience. But before I play the video, I just want to give you a little bit of background. See, it feels a little bit strange introducing someone who's not actually here, but important that you understand the background to our keynote speaker, I think. So, yeah, Pippa Britton is Vice Chair of Sport Wales and UCAD currently, but previously been Chair of Disability Sport Wales. She's also double Paralympian, double World Champion, and also Wales' most successful archer, and made the podium at 6 consecutive World Championships. So, got that really nice balance in terms of sort of lots of work within governance, but also the perspective of an athlete as well. So, without further ado, I'll play the video. Hopefully, there we go.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I'm really sorry that I can't be with you today, but I've got some lurgy. I'm going to try and get through what I'm going to say to you without coughing too much all the way through. And I'm sure you've had lots of PowerPoints today, so I'm not going to use any PowerPoint at all. And I thought today I would talk briefly about whether classification can learn from anti-doping. And I've posed this question because at their heart, really, fairness in both of these systems is down to personal integrity. And I'm sure you're wondering what makes me the expert on this. Well, I'm actually chair of a classification advisory group at the British Paralympic Association. I'm the vice chair of UK Anti-Doping, and I'm also a Paralympian. So I've got kind of experience from all spheres, really, around this. So I guess I'm not an expert, but I do have lots of opinions, and I thought I'd just kind of share a few thoughts with you today. And first of all, I thought I might touch on some of the history of anti-doping, because it's actually the International Olympic Committee in the 1960s that started the battle against doping. And despite a lack of understanding and some pretty weak support from the sports community, a series of measures were taken through the 1970s and the 1980s, and they still form kind of the cornerstones of today's anti-doping strategy. And it set in motion all those procedures that we all know at the moment for testing and lab accreditation, all of those things that we have today. And then WADA was actually set up in 1999. And that the idea of that was to kind of harmonise all of those things together. And when we talk about the history of classification, there are some really similar dates involved. Of course, we've all heard of the birth of the movement. I mean, it's very famous, London 2012. A lot was made of the fact that the movement was born in Stoke Mandeville after the war, after the Second World War. But it wasn't until 1960 that it was called the Paralympic Games. And the first formal classification system was set up in 1964. And the current classification code was actually approved in 2007. So there's been some changes over time. So we can see in terms of professionalisation in sport, there are lots of parallels in the history, particularly within those kind of dates. But there aren't really that very many classification cheats caught. And there are plenty of doping cheats who are caught. Now, this could be because there aren't any. But in an increasingly sophisticated world where money and sponsorship are all at stake, the incentive for any competitor, whether that's an Olympic or a Paralympic competitor, to try and gain the advantage over another is there, and the stakes are increasingly high. And when we think about doping, particularly moving on from the Cold War years, really a hard line has been taken. You know, people are really happy to use words like cheats. And if you go onto Wikipedia, you know, you can find lists of all of the people who've ever been caught doping, whether they've done it deliberately or not. But when it comes to classification, we don't talk about this at all, really, do we? And my question would be really, well, why don't we talk about it more? So do we think it's because all people with disabilities are angels? Of course, I'm sure that's not quite true, but do we think when people acquire an impairment that they suddenly acquire a kind of side order of integrity that goes along with that? Well, of course not. And people are people, you know, with their own hopes and their own dreams and frailties. And we need to be thinking a bit more about how that might make them act. So again, you know, history plays its part, but so does society and conversation. So we live in a Western democratic nation, which is apparently inclusive. I know that there'll be lots of people sitting in the audience here today who perhaps don't agree with that, but still. But research shows that 65% of people are still uncomfortable talking about disability or talking to people with a disability about their disability, typically. And so what does that have to do with integrity, and what does it have to do with classification? Well, for sure, it puts up a barrier in the kinds of discussions that we might have, like today, that you might all have over coffee or what have you, and how that is all reflected in wider society. So I thought I might take the opportunity to share a short anecdote with you. Something happened to me when I was in Beijing, and I got on the bus one day, and there was a girl on the bus, and she was missing her forearm, and she had a little elbow, and she was holding something in between the crook of her elbow and her bicep. And I was staring, I'm afraid. I was just fascinated because I hadn't seen anybody be able to use it as much and in the way that she did. I was really interested to see how she'd managed to overcome this. And she saw me looking, and she said, don't tell anybody that I can move my elbow, because she said that'll move me up a class. Now, you know, I'm guessing in her mind, she wasn't cheating. She was just bending the rules a little bit to be in the class she wanted to be in. But how is that any different from taking a microdose of a drug and hoping it won't get spotted in your sample? Now, to be honest, at the time I wasn't really sure who I was going to tell anyway, but I suppose the most obvious person for me to approach about it would have been one of the classifiers. And this is where history kind of gets even more messy, because early classifiers wanted competitors. They didn't want to classify people out of the system. Early Paralympic sport was really about inclusion, you know, giving people self-esteem and a reason to train and a reason to get up in the morning and do something and to have, you know, all the ambition and the benefits that sports gives you. So I spoke to a classifier who started classifying in the 1960s, and that's exactly what she told me, that she would always give the benefit of the doubt. She even told me that as time progressed and the codes changed, and a more recent IPC code, she would overlook if somebody had an eligible impairment or not an eligible impairment if she thought it would give them the chance of competing. Now, leaving aside the ethical considerations of what that would do to an athlete if they were later excluded from sport if it came to light, and the duty of care implications that classifier has to that athlete, it does sport a disservice to allow people to compete against others with an unfair advantage. And isn't that what performance-enhancing drugs are all about? An unfair advantage. And all of this, of course, is before we take into account any equipment that suggests, that assists Paralympic athletes and gives an incentive actually to some support staff to bend the rules by making legs an inch longer or chair backs an inch higher. Worse is that it probably disadvantages the less well-off countries even more, because they can't put the investment in that some of the rich Western nations can. And anybody who's been to a Paralympic Games will be able to tell you stories about how they've seen, so perhaps an athlete from a poor African nation walking around, with, instead of a prosthesis, what looks like a broomstick with a foot attached to the end, as opposed to some USA athlete in this amazing kind of prosthesis that looks like it comes out of a Star Wars movie. So is this fair? And if it's not fair, what are we doing about it? So lots of questions, I guess, that I've posed you, and I'm hoping that you'll go away and have a bit of coffee this afternoon and you'll have a chat about them. But I'll stick a few questions to you and then you can have a think about them. So, at the end of the day, are the support staff breaking the rules? And if so, what should we do about it? Was the classifier I was talking about a cheat or just a really well-meaning individual? And what about the athletes? Should we get them to sign up to something like, 100% me and sit under the same kind of strict liability that we have in anti-doping? And at the moment, athletes are told that they need to make their best effort. But, having come from a sport where we have actually had a ban for an archer who is intentionally misrepresented, it's a sport of archery, I know that he obviously didn't try his hardest in classification. So should the athletes be the ones who know the rules of their sport? And if they don't bend their elbow, for example, then should we know that? And should we treat them like any other cheat? Should we do routine testing in classification, in and out of competition, to make sure that people are affected in the way that they say they are? So these are all subjects that we need to talk about. I just thought there's some of the thoughts that I have had about the kind of parallels between the two systems. And, being one of those 65% people is not helping move this conversation along. So I'm going to leave you with one thought, and that is start talking, because unless we start talking, we won't end up with the fairest system that we possibly can end up with. So thank you very much, everybody. And I was really pleased I managed to get through without coughing once. Thank you. Bye.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that. I mean, obviously, it's a shame not to have the opportunity to ask questions, but I think instead what Pippa's done there is sort of bounce back some questions at us, some rhetorical questions to get us all thinking. So maybe ones that we want to sort of reflect on and then put into further sessions later on, or ones that you want to discuss over coffee later. But certainly, for me, there's certainly some comments there that sort of echoed some of the concerns with classification and fairness in sport that we've been discussing so far today. And definitely we can see some parallels there between classification and doping. So yeah, really interesting presentation.